Thank you for not being distracted by Real Madrid, who are outside in the quad there. But this evening we have our own set of superstars to engage us. So my name is Ken McPhail. I'm the incoming head of this tremendous business school, Alliance Manchester Business School. And I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to the many people who are joining us virtually this evening via our online link. So as the title suggests, our Vital Topics series give us the opportunity to explore and debate topics that are fundamentally challenging to established business and medical practices. Topics that represent new opportunities for business growth, new opportunities for health promotion, but also they represent established threats to established business models and practices as well. So these are topics which present new opportunities to create social and economic value, but which also pose new social and environmental threats. Well, tonight our topic is at the intersection of technology and healthcare, and the question of whether the acceleration in digital innovation is likely to improve patient outcomes and experience. So to our superstars this evening, I'm delighted that we are joined by three very experienced speakers who are going to help us explore these issues further. Stephen Critchlow will give us an opening address. Stephen is CEO and Chair of Evergreen Life, one of our own graduates here at the University of Manchester, graduating in pharmacy with further studies in pharmacokinetics. We're also joined by Niels Peek. Niels is Professor of Health Informatics here at the university and has a background in computer science and artificial intelligence, focusing on translational data science for clinical risk prediction, precision health, and multi-morbidity. So Niels also leads a hugely exciting development here, which he may tell us more about during his comments, the Christabel Pankhurst Institute for Health Technology, Research and Innovation. That's a partnership between health, industry and public sector organisations. Our third speaker, Caroline J, is a computer science and research professor at the School of Engineering. Caroline is both a psychologist and a computer scientist, and she combines these disciplines and leads research across these domains, along with holding her role as research director for the Software Sustainability Institute. So a tremendous panel this evening that are going to help us explore these issues further. Finally, let me introduce our own colleague here at the University of Manchester Alliance Business School, who will be facilitating the event this evening, and that's Panos Konstantinides. Panos is Professor of Digital Innovation and Digital Learning Lead for Executive Education here in the Business School. He holds a PhD from the Judge at the University of Cambridge and is a Fellow of the Cambridge Digital Innovation Centre. So there will be plenty of opportunity for your questions and discussion after our panelists have introduced the topic. And I'd now like to hand over to Panos, who is going to lead us into the talks. Panos.
Thank you, Ken, and welcome from me as well. Thank you for coming, and thank you for those who are joining virtually. So the way we structured the event today is to give our speakers the opportunity to make some position statements, talk about their work, about their plans, about their vision of digital health. And that would take 10 minutes approximately each. before then moving on to our panel discussion. So I will invite Stephen first to start, followed by Niels, and then followed by Carol. Stephen?
Thank you very much. Okay, so Stephen Critchlow from Evergreen. In Evergreen, we focus on social impact, and in health, in particular in Evergreen Life, what we're focusing on is how can we focus on people in healthcare in a way that often our organizations don't. So what happens if we decide to focus on people as our ultimate aim in healthcare, and we look to help get them a healthy and happy life? Just take it the simple thing we're trying to do in healthcare. So Evergreen Life started a journey in 2014 to do that. And what we decided was the key to doing that was to helping people to own their own health information. So generally, if you go to an organization, it will store the information it needs to prove that they have treated you, and they may share it with you, but often they don't share it with each other. So anybody in the room who may not have intersected with the NHS at the moment, who thinks there's a health record for you, there isn't. Okay. But that you can pull together with Evergreen Life the different places that you visit and put everything into one place was the starting point of that. But going on that journey, what we realized is that we suddenly had people who we needed to serve, and yet our NHS doesn't do it at the point that you're trying to remain well, for example. We actually normally step in when you start to get sick. So therefore, we suddenly had a need out there that needed addressing. And what we do on the app is we actually serve content to you based on both your medical record and questions that you answer. And we find some great results in terms of doing that. So simple things like people who under their medical record we noticed have recently been hypertensive at their GP. We can offer them advice on the type of diet, the lifestyle that you may have. And we find that 60% of them within 6 months no longer have hypertension. And that's doing something which clearly we don't get paid for because there isn't even a market for it, says here in a business school. But that data that then can be collected can start to mean that we can improve the efficiency of health services, the efficiency in a way that you may get cared for once you do get sick. And so what we then do is we have software that serves those markets. There are people from Evergreen at the back. I don't know whether you just want to put your hands up. You know, these are the guys who really do it. I just talk about it. Yeah. And so what we actually do is we help with when people want to get into a GP practice at the moment. I don't know whether you've all got great GP practice, but you're very lucky if you have. Often there are queues at 8 o'clock for everybody. Yeah, I can see everybody nodding. I'm already on that one. But what we do is we allow people to put in their own complaint, and we use digital technology to triage them so that the most expensive and least available people are kept for the people who really need it. It's called digital triage. And then we do workflow, very simple stuff. But along that way, we start to collect data. So a good example of that will appeal to this audience is that in dermatology, we've been collecting the data from teledermatology for some years to the point that we can use that data to do AI on. So what we can do is take the images that we've got from people where we know the histopathology outcome and use it to train a model to do diagnosis. In that area, we're taking, in terms of GPs, we're taking places that couldn't see 50% of their patients in 2 weeks and turning that round to seeing every patient within the same day and 90% within 88 minutes. If you take the dermatology service, we're taking places that have 33-week waits and turning those into 1.7 days and doing it at less money than the NHS used to pay in a way that we can do it for everybody in the country with the clinicians we've currently got. And that's the cycle that we've got here. Because what you do is you start with collecting data with people online. You go through to having digital healthcare services improved, use research, and we work really closely with people like Niels to do that, to come out the other end. In the case of the dermatology, it was done with Durham. We have about 25 university partners, and it's great. There's no competition in research because everybody joins in to get things done. So what's the kind of barriers we have to deal with, and what's the technology we're talking about? Well, the traditional systems that we work with are generally like this. If you're into health IT, that will be a familiar model to you. A few people in the room nodding. And that's basically designed to mean that the system, the place where you go, will be able to have the records of what they've done once you've left. Okay. And then they decide that they'll do this thing called a portal. And it might be called a patient portal. Some confusingly, it might be called a PHR, a personal health record. It's not. It's just a view onto that organisation system, even if that's the NHS app, because what they're letting you do is see what happens in England. If you live in Carlisle and get your services from both Scotland and England, you'll have to have a different app or a different way of doing it in Scotland. And if you then go into private care, there will be no records stored. What we do, I'm afraid this slide should move, and I'm glad I've checked them beforehand. But what we do is we take all the data, whether that's from, we're linked to every GP in the country, we can download those GP records for you to share as you wish. And we take documents. So if you have letters sent to your home that aren't in that record, you can put them in the record yourself. We have a DNA test to help you contribute to that record for both yourself, to help with your advice on your well-being, as well as help us contribute better to research. And we put it all in one place. When I do a click, it should be one green blob, it won't be. And that's your PHR. It's not sitting on a server in an organization, it's sitting in the cloud, looked after by us on your behalf as a data controller, where the agreement with you is it will only get shared with your permission. And that means you've got a complete record when you go and see your GP, and it means you've got a complete record when we want to contribute to research. But even better than that, you're online to do some of the research, and even better than that, we could come to you, and if it's a particular research project we need permission from you, you're online to ask, and we can select the cohort that day. So we can take out years out of the development cycle. This compares us with other people that you may use to get data in the university. Being online, having a breadth of data, having genetics added as well, all of the things I've just talked about, the other suppliers do some of them individually, but we don't believe anybody else does them all. Okay. So starting with personal care, moving out into healthcare and efficiency, and having a wealth of data from 3 million users to be able to provide data for research, whether that's purely for the interests of society, as we did during COVID, where we did heat maps of the spread of COVID, working with this university to do it, both the maths department and the medical department, or whether that's to do more pragmatic research in workflows, which we're doing with Lancaster, for example. So we have a national contract with NHS England to allow us to be able to connect to every GP in the country, and we are an assured app under that. We have over 200 GPs that process 3 times as many appointments, I understood from Tom, who's here today, as the NHS app does each month. That's 600,000 appointments. We have 18 hospital contracts, there are 60 clinics that we look after. So we actually own some of the contracts as a supplier to the NHS. So we own 9 GP practices and 60 clinics, and those are all contributing to the data model that allows us to do the research we've talked about. But more than that, we can innovate and change. So I'm learning tonight the difference between innovation and research, and I won't steal Niels' thunder because I've seen his slides, but I think that's a really important subject that we need to stop and consider. So when you see them, take attention, it's really worthwhile. So we have research collaborators. They are often universities, but NHS hospitals themselves, as well as pharma. This is the spread of where we go. The app is available in every country other than Russia, but we focus on this country in terms of our services and our offerings. These are the types of results we get. A lot of them come from basic digital health IT, but all of them are collecting data for AI-based products in the future, which is what tonight is really about. I would expect, as a pharmacist trained here, not really practiced that for many decades, but through our customers know about it, that the BNFI I carried in my pocket when I was a pharmacist on the wards at MRI or at Royal Mounted Children's Hospital, is being replaced with what the team at Evergreen have given me, which is they've given me my personal copy of the BNF. It's got each drug in it that based on my genetics that says which drug is right for me, which dose is right for me. Well, I get these side effects. That helps the drug to be selected for me on a personalized basis. So the whole of healthcare will head to the point where all of our decisions are made based on you as an individual, and the technology I've just talked about will not only be beneficial, it'll be essential. It'll be the way healthcare is done. We are getting to the point where personalized DNA checks can result in an MRI vaccine to treat the disease that's come from your own genetics. That's heading our way, and that's the level that personalized healthcare will get to, but certainly within many people in this room's lifetime. These are some of the projects we're working on. I've mentioned the dermatology one, where we made everything very efficient with normal digital health technology, but we've gone the whole way to be able to do the diagnostic based initially on a dermoscope, and more recently on the phone, using your phone camera, and that even the camera now is coming out at 96% specificity. We're ready to go to medical device on it. I've talked about diabetes, and I can talk about some of these others in the question time if you wish. So thank you very much. I believe we're not doing questions now.
No, not
That's
now.
right.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Niels.
Right. Thanks, Paz. Thanks, Stephen. So we are going to talk about the Christopher Pankers Institute. And that institute is about basically what I would consider to be one of my obsessions, which is, as Stephen was already alluding to, the gap between health technology research and health innovation. And I think that gap is massive. And we need to do something about that, because it's one of the biggest problems, I think, that we have in this area. And it's also the reason that we have this institute. So I have the privilege of leading an institute that tries to address exactly that gap. It's not a conventional university institute, academic institute, because it's a partnership between the University of Manchester and partners from the NHS, from industry, and from the local government. So basically what it does, it connects the health technology researchers within this university to the health innovation ecosystem that we have in Greater Manchester. And this is, I think, the gap, the slide that Stephen was already alluding to, which I think is an interesting illustration of what this gap is between research and innovation, which is driven by so many different things. So there's, between these worlds of research and innovation, typically different terminology, different languages that people speak, but most importantly, what drives them is very, very different. And I come myself from the world of research, obviously, and I've worked many, many years in health technology research. And what I did was publish papers. And I remember at some point, someone asked me, so the stuff you're talking about, that's meant to help, patient lives and improve clinical care, etc. Is that actually happening? And my answer for a long time used to be, well, that's now for others to do with the papers that I've published, I guess. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I realized that's actually not really happening. And I guess that's led me to the role that I currently have, where I'm trying to help people to bridge this gap. There's these differences in language, in drivers, resources, and also obsessions and taboos, I think it's fair to say. A good example, I think, we saw during the pandemic. And I think what's interesting here is the contrast between areas of medicine where there are really well-established translational pathways. So drugs are a good example. So development of new drugs can take a long time, but we know exactly what needs to happen at each and every stage, all the way from basic science to deployment in clinical practice. And we saw that, for instance, and also that it can go actually very quickly with the vaccines that were developed during the pandemic, the COVID-19. Unfortunately, in my field, in AI, things were quite different. So hundreds of AI tools were being developed. Lots of data sets were being made available very quickly under different change governance rules because there was a pandemic. But from all those tools, very, very few were actually deployed in clinical practice. And very often, the simple reason for that was that they were not developed thinking about the actual clinical decision problems that exist in clinical practice. People just use data to develop a model. And the model was nice, but it wasn't something that people actually needed. So there was this paper in the MIT Technology Review about that, all those hundreds of AI tools that actually never helped a single patient because they weren't used. So I think that's something that needs to change. That's why we have the Pancras Institute. So we're a collaboration with partners in the region. Our mission is to make a positive change in health and care for all through multidisciplinary and collaborative development, evaluation, and implementation of new health technologies. And we've had investment through the local growth fund in the institute, particularly for a building that was opened just 2 months ago, so it's still very new. I've got some slides here from the last 18 months where the building was developed. And we opened that up, like I said, just 2 months ago. And it's not a conventional office space, it's a space for collaboration. So it's meant that it's bringing people from different schools and faculties across this campus together in a single building, but also bringing them together, for instance, with partners from the NHS, with industry partners. So that's very, very exciting, and inviting you to come and have a look on Dover Street at the new building. So just to tell you a little bit more about what we do, we've got 3 technology areas that we focus on in the Pancras Institute: digital, which is led by myself, materials, led by Julie Guff, and AI, led by Sammy Kasky. And then we've got 4 cross-cutting themes. One of the most important ones is translation, led by Claudia Lindner. We've got responsible and inclusive innovation, led by Robert Mackin. We've got digital health inequities, led by Sabine van der Veer. And finally, multi-omics health technologies, led by Dewey Gupta. As I mentioned, that translation cross-cutting theme is one of our most important pieces of work. And this is a sneak preview of the work that Claudia is doing. As I mentioned, I think for some healthcare innovations, we've got a very good translational pathway. So drugs is the best example there. I think for many other health technologies, we do not have that. So that's one of the things that we're trying to develop. So here's the translational roadmap that we have developed for invasive medical devices. We also have a version for non-invasive medical devices and also one for software as a medical device. They're quite similar, but not exactly the same because there are differences between the different types of technologies. I won't go into detail here, but basically what this roadmap tells you is what is it that you have to do at each of the different stages of technology readiness levels in order to make sure that later on you will be able to translate your innovation into clinical practice. So for instance, what is it that you need to do already at the stage of doing your basic research in terms of thinking about the business model that could exist, or for instance, whether the device or innovation that you're developing will be regulated and how. So all those things that typically happen further down the line, and typically researchers have a tendency to postpone the questions about those steps ahead of them. We're trying to encourage them to think about those things early on in the translational roadmap. So that's me. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Caroline.
So I'm a psychologist and a computer scientist, or somewhere between the two. I combine these two. And my research focus, because I am primarily a researcher, starting to be an innovator, and fortunately the Pankhurst is helping with that, just starting that journey. But I'm really interested in this intersection between people and technology, and how an understanding of human behavior can help improve the way we design technology and ensure that it really works for people. So there are lots of different methods we can use for understanding what people are doing with technology and understanding their behaviour. So if you are Amazon, for example, you might monitor data on your platform. So people buying things from your website, your goal is to increase your profit margins. And so what you can do is you can systematically reorganize the user interface and see whether that increases profits, right? So you can do all of these things automatically. And that's great when you have a clearly defined goal. When you are developing health technology, it's a lot more complex than that. And so you've kind of often got, you know, many different questions you want to answer, and just you can't automate the analysis. So one of the things that remains really, really important, particularly at the early stages, is just talking to people. And so this is one of the key approaches we use when we're designing software. So what you can see on the screen at the moment are some workshops, co-creation workshops, where we have been designing technologies to help people monitor respiratory symptoms. So these are two applications. So one is Britain Breathing, which helps people monitor hay fever symptoms. And then we use that data to understand how those might be affected by pollution. And then we had a spin-off from that, which was looking at people with COPD, so older people with chronic severe respiratory symptoms. And what we learned through doing that is, so first of all, it's a really good idea to talk to people before you design any software at all, right, before you write any code. And we've got a paper prototype that you can see on the bottom left there. And this is literally where we sit down and people basically draw what they want or put together what they want. So this gives you a really good idea of how screens should look before you even start building any software at all. But the other thing it showed us, it was a really good lesson for us, I think, in the importance of having these discussions with people, because as somebody who's designing technology, you will bring your own assumptions to what that technology should look like. One of the things we learned through this process was that the way you collect data from people, actually, you really need to take the end user group into account. So on the left, you can see a screen from Britain Breathing. And this is where people are putting in symptoms about their nose, eyes, breathing, and so on. These hay fever symptoms, and they use a slider to do that. So you move from 0 to severe using these sliders. And we assumed that we could do the same for COPD. So these were going to be people who had smartphones. So they were relatively technology savvy, but they were older, but still able to use the technology. And in fact, when we sat down with them, we found that this wasn't the case. They didn't feel comfortable with sliders because of dexterity issues. And they wanted to have something where they were more confident about the fact that they supplied us with the right data. So they used radio buttons instead. So you would click on one of these and it's a larger surface area for you to be able to tap on. And so, so you would be able to supply that data with confidence. And of course, people can monitor their own symptoms using these apps as well. And one thing I can confidently say is that at the time, the project team were all under 40. They're not all under 40 anymore. But they were, you know, thinking there's obviously slides to the answer. You know, this is not going to be a problem for anyone. And there's no way we would have predicted without actually talking to people that wasn't going to work. Okay, no way. So talking to people is really important. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that it's not just about the end user. It's not just about the person who's at the kind of direct interface with the technology. So I have a colleague, Emily Collins, who is going to be joining the university very soon. And her expertise is in ethics and trust in robotics. And she works within organisations, and she told me recently about a situation in a lot of physiotherapy practices. And there are some really good robotics devices that have been developed to help with physiotherapy. And what happens is the practice will buy one of these, and then they will put it in a treatment room within the practice. And so it'll sit in the corner, and the physiotherapist may come in, and they might put their coat over it. And then at the end of the day, they'll take their coat off it and they'll go home again. And these devices aren't being used because people don't feel confident using them. So the therapist might be used to working with their hands. They haven't maybe received proper training, or if they have received training, they still don't feel particularly comfortable with it. They know that some of their patients who might be older might not feel comfortable using this technology as well. And so what you've got is essentially millions of pounds of investment going into not helping any patients, simply because there's just this cultural organizational issue, you know, where I'm just not confident about it. So, and that immediately kills it, right? That's the end of it. And so thinking about these things within an organizational context is really, really important as well. And so that's a sort of another focus point. And of course, you know, we're talking about AI. That's a really key topic at the moment. It's been in the news a bit. And one of the things this does is introduce a whole other area of complexity. Okay, so we're not just talking about interacting with a device or using an app, we're talking about loads of complex computation that is happening that can potentially be difficult for people to understand. So one of the areas I have worked in for probably about 10 years now is ECG interpretation. And I'm interested in it for two perspectives. So firstly, I'm interested in how people do it. How do people learn to be experts in interpreting ECGs? So that's the sort of psychology part of it. And then I'm interested in how we support people in interpreting them. So, you know, is there a way we can represent the data that will help them to understand it better? And then, of course, as a computer scientist, I'm interested in how we automate it as well. So how can we get computers to interpret ECGs? How can we improve this? And of course, there's been lots of research that's been going on in this area for a long time. So in fact, automated interpretation of ECGs has been available for decades. On a lot of machines, they will give automated kind of responses about the kind of condition that you might detect within the ECG. And within practice at the moment, clinicians don't trust these. They tend not to rely on them. They don't understand how they're working. They tend to be proprietary, so we don't really know what's going on. And so they would always either ignore them or double check or overrule. So all of these things happen. Recently, we have been making some more progress using techniques like deep learning. So taking images in particular of ECGs and giving a computer a lot of data, and it's able to learn to pull out conditions that might be within the ECG. So this remains very complex because there's not one condition, so it remains a really difficult problem. But we are starting to make progress with that. But the interesting thing about that kind of machine learning approach is that there is still a challenge, particularly with something like ECG interpretation, where we've got loads of conditions. So you're not just looking for one. There remains this challenge with, you know, how is the algorithm making its decision? You know, where is this coming from? If it says this, how do I know I can trust it? And where you have a sort of a black box algorithm where it's not immediately clear, then again, that raises this issue with trust and so on. So one of the things that we've been doing within my research group is looking at how we can revisualize ECG data. So what you can see on the screen, typically you would have it in a line on Cartesian coordinates, and we've got these presented for mobile devices here, so you can see them on polar coordinates. It's just in a circle instead. And using things like colour, so borrowing techniques that have been used in things like economics for a long time to expose time series patterns and things. And it turns out we can use these for ECGs as well. So what we can do is we can colour in the area under the curve in the ECG. And pretty much, I hope, I was going to say, yeah, the colours, you can just about see the colours. Sometimes these get washed out by a projector, but hopefully if you can see the colours, you'll be able to see that the ECGs at the top, where we have on the left a slower heart rate and on the right a faster heart rate, are normal because they have mainly cooler colours. Okay, so we're looking at a particular arrhythmia here that's called long QT syndrome, which can lead to sudden death. Obviously, we want to avoid that. So at the top, the people don't have to worry, whereas the ones underneath have warmer colours in. So we see more yellow, more red. And this immediately tells us that there is an issue with this particular interval. So just by showing that, you know, exposing these features in the data, it immediately makes this task much simpler. So it used to take clinicians years to learn how to do this. It's manually very technical, kind of how you would measure these things, that you have to, you know, use tangent rules and detect the ends of curves and make a decision about how to cut it off and things. And this is just kind of reorganizing the data so it's easier for people to do it. And the other interesting thing about this is, of course, it then makes it trivial to get a computer to do it. Okay, it's really easy now because we know what rules to use. Okay, so we can use different rules to the signal processing ones we were using before. We can also add in clinical rules. So we know from the literature, you know, how certain waves within the ECG may change with this condition. So we can include these as well. And when you speak to patients or clinicians, they go, oh, brilliant. Yeah, this is great because, you know, I can share this representation of the data with the algorithm. I can see exactly how it's working. I can see how it's made its decisions. So you can verbalize the rules so the algorithm can actually explain itself to you. Great, okay. So yeah, we've made some progress. But of course, when you speak to computer scientists, they're like, they kind of don't understand it. It's sort of like, well, why are you bothering with that? Just give the machine the data and let it work it out. Why are you actually writing algorithms that doesn't make any sense? And I think it's really interesting because, of course, they're right. So this kind of approach where if you take, you know, a single condition and you write an algorithm specifically for that, it's not scalable. Okay, so what we have with machine learning is something that's scalable. There's always this idea that you give it enough data, it will learn. And so both parties have a point here, okay? And so my own perspective is probably the way that we should design technology is somewhere in between. I think this is for discussion. But I just thought I'd leave you with that kind of tension that illustrates that what people who are using the technology want from it and the way they think it should be designed does not always match with the, you know, engineers who are actually creating it. And I guess we can move on to the discussion now.
Thank you, Carolyn. Well, all three of you raised quite a lot of interesting issues, and I think what cuts across is the various tensions, whether the tensions are between the patient and the carer, research and industry, you know, all the different stakeholders that are involved in the development of these solutions, right? So I'll try and capture some of those tensions with some questions. So Stephen, first addressing you, you mentioned that the key objective behind the Evergreen Life app is to provide patients with an accurate, up-to-date electronic patient record. By means then to offer the patients to manage their own condition, essentially, right? Allow them to monitor their data, but also to carry around their data everywhere. And then that provides opportunities for personalized medicine, precision medicine, a personalized recommendation for their health and wellness. So, and you mentioned some examples, the dermatology, the diabetes, the cardiac monitoring, etc. I think there's a huge trend nowadays. I think with people becoming more aware of their own condition, the need has been increased, right? I want to know more about my condition, right? And I want to be informed. I want to be empowered, right? So I want to maybe if you can comment on this process of patient empowerment on the one hand, and on the other hand, how you, Evergreen Life app, is helping with that. You know, how do you do it? How do you make sure that what you provide is in fact accurate and up to date?
Okay, so there's quite a lot of questions within that apparently single question. The first starting point of it is we believe accurate data is more than an EPR. So because that's word contains the word patient, which is at the point you were already sick. You know, we need data from before that. So we start to collect diet and lifestyle data from people who aren't sick at the moment. And what we do there with that, the way we capture that, it's slightly gamified. It gives you a wellness score. So if you're doing the things that you're unlikely to get well, you get nearer to 100. Okay. So what we start to do is get some data that's completely missing from every other record, which is longitudinal lifestyle data. Because if we're going to go into personalized healthcare based on genetics, we kind of know DNA plus environment equals outcome, but we're missing the environment bit entirely. So the first thing is get the environment bit. The next thing is focus on reducing the getting ill in the first place. Because the reason that the Western medicine is dying globally is because our resources aren't sufficient to supply it. Nothing to do with money, but to do with the number of people who are well are getting too few to treat the number of people who are sick. So in this country, we get sick 10 years earlier than they do in Sweden or Japan. And there's really good reasons, and that's diet and lifestyle. So an honest relationship with people, let them understand their own well-being, send them content. So how do we ensure the quality of it? We have qualified doctors and health researchers providing content on the app. We have a committee of people who make sure any advice is always done in the interests of people and their health, and that is available on the app, using AI to deliver it. But actually on it, when I'm saying AI, it's the first rudimentary basics of rule-based AI, which is the clinician has decided that the cohort of people who meet that criteria should get that piece of information. And that's the way we're working at the moment. So I think that goes some way to answering what you're saying.
Yes, yes, thank you. And I guess over to you, Caroline. I want to push back a little bit on the point of stakeholder engagement, right? So Stephen said that, obviously the clinicians decide, right? And well, you need to have a proxy of some sort, right? You need to have someone to rely on. And in this case, it's the clinicians that provide that environmental data, if I understood you correctly, of monitoring and deciding what that data should be, right? So the parameters, right? But then we have the computer scientists or the other researchers on the other end that are saying, well, as you said, right? What are you doing? Just why are you building algorithms, right? Just let the system do it for you. So I guess there's a tension there, right? So maybe you can comment on some of those tensions and how are those tensions resolved in order to achieve that accuracy and the quality of data that is required in the first place?
Oh, I'd love to be able to answer that question. Right. So, I mean, I think the key thing, and I think we're moving in this direction, is really good communication between everyone. So not so long ago, we designed technology without speaking to anyone at all, right? So the people who design the technology are the people who are interested in technology. So this is a whole other talk, but systemizers are people who are interested in systems and like to design systems, and empathizers are people who are interested in people, okay? And what we need is for those two groups of people to work together, right? So we need to have dialogue between the two. I think though what you're saying, Panos, is it's really interesting because there are these multiple stakeholders within a kind of any setting, and so you need to make sure that everybody's voices are heard. And so obviously clinicians really important for anything related to health, and they're going to provide really useful contextual data as well as the expertise to demonstrate that things are working as they should and be able to sort of test things. And then you might have, in terms of how you design your user interface, you might be speaking with sort of patients who are using it, or indeed clinicians. So it depends on the group there, and you're testing it with them. But I think also from a technology perspective, it's really important for that dialogue to be there with people who are designing technology as well, because I think a lot of the time you do get this huge disconnect between the way in which technology is designed and what people who are designing the kind of cutting edge AI think is really important, and what people on the ground actually want. And I think we really need to try to bring those closer together. And I think it is starting to happen. But I think in a lot of places it still doesn't. And you can see, for example, there have been issues recently with certain social media apps where ethics advisors have been fired. This kind of thing, so it's kind of one step forward, two steps back, it feels like sometimes, but I think that those discussions are happening more.
Yeah. And Neil, over to you. Yeah, please comment on that.
Chip in. I'm going to derail the order a little bit.
Please.
I think, in this discussion, I was just thinking, I think it's important to realize in health, it's really hard to get a ground truth. And ultimately, what the real ground truth is something like survival, right? So anything that prolongs survival and survival in good health, with good quality of life, that's what we're looking for. But very often, we're much too far away from that. And then we have to rely on well, what people think. So for instance, what clinicians think is important or useful or good, or what the diagnosis is.
Yeah.
But obviously there's going to be a lot of, well, subjectivity in there and error as well. I think it's different than in other areas. So if you think about how digital transformation has changed retail, in retail, we're looking for the outcome of a transaction, which is a customer that pays. That's the endpoint. We're not interested in anything beyond that. That typically happens fairly quickly, which means that you can improve things also with an enormous pace, because that endpoint happens so often. Whereas in health, in life, the endpoint that is relevant, fortunately, doesn't happen that often. So it's harder to use data and digital transformation to improve things.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned ground truth. I have a PhD student in the audience that's working on a project that looks at the patients being in the ICU, and the ground truth is obviously whether patients are intubated or not. That's the ground truth. But we found that actually it all depends on hospital resources. So if the hospital doesn't have any beds, then ground truth becomes a variable. You need to make decisions on the basis of who is in dire need of being intubated and using one of the beds in the ICU versus someone that can wait. And those are life and death decisions that shouldn't take place ideally, right? They shouldn't take place. Ground truth should be objective, but in fact, in reality, it is very subjective. Stephen, I see you want to jump in. No?
Well, I was just thinking on intensive care. I used to work on intensive care units for over 10 years, and we in those days had to play, I'm going to call it those games, because in those days you had to work out which beds you could, you could populate with the next person. But what I was going to say, if it's okay to follow this on, because I think it's a really important point, is the problem with ground truths is that they will all have some kind of bias. And unfortunately, and I think the debate about AI is fascinating, because I don't think people are drawing the parallels between what we do when we do it manually with what we do when we do it automatically. At the end of the day, AI is only a tool like any other. It's not, I think in the press, it's translated to it's an artificial brain of some kind. It's not. It is not. It's just simply not. Mm-hmm. But what it does is do what intelligent human beings do and replace them in certain processes. So if with AI, you often go to base truths. The trouble with medicine is most of the research that those base truths come from can't be replicated because it was biased. And I can tell you, people within Evergreen are challenging that a lot. Okay, so I did use the example of how we use a committee to make the decisions on which cohort, and that's what we do. But there's also other stuff that we're doing. I use the example of the dermatology. The way a physician would evaluate a mole for cancer is very well documented. It's 8 different patterns of the mole, right? And you come up with a score. Now, clearly, we could have written a model that did that, and it's not very complicated to do so. Or we could say, well, there's only 8 patterns that clinician's looking for, and we've now got a tool that look for over 1 million patterns. In fact, so many patterns, it can decide how many to look at. The only thing it does is cost processing power, and it's not cheap to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. So the model that we are using, I'm not sure exactly how many million it's up to now, because you get more millions the more coins you put in the Amazon processing machine, and to work out whether your mole is cancerous or not. And I think that's explicable to any patient. You know, your clinician has time to look at 8 and give a score. The computer has time to look at 2 million patterns and give a score. The clinician gets 65%, can go away saying they're okay. With AI, we can do that at 90-odd%. So that's 1 in 3 people who don't need a biopsy and are still safe. Well, that's explicable, isn't it? And that's using raw AI, not the base. But the really exciting thing we've had in the company is something we call game of life. Because having seen that played out, working with Durham, we then said, well, what happens if we use all the data we have on, we've now been going eight continuous years with people recording their lifestyle to evaluate the progression of disease, to predict their lifespan and their health span. But what came out of that was we can do one step more than that. We can say genetically where your life expectancy should be on average. And we can say which 5 things you're doing that means you're either behind that, or which 5 things should you do to mean you'll be ahead of that. And that's all done with raw AI, or raw machine learning, should I say. It's not done by predictive modeling, by using base data and building from there. So there are things you can do with AI that are unbelievable with the tools applied appropriately. It is understandable, it is explicable, and we should just try it.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, the cutting edge of innovation, right? I mean, that's what you're aiming at. You're aiming at the cutting edge of innovation, right? It's pushing the boundaries. But we always need to hold back. You mentioned earlier this idea of genetics or genomics or omics is only part of it, right? Then you also have environment, and that environment involves socioeconomic, cultural, behavioral, and other factors that you cannot anticipate with that raw machine. I mean, it's impossible because you don't have all that data, or at least the data that you have it's full of errors, it's full of biases, it's full of, missing variables, etc., etc. So my question is over to Niels, right? The Pankhurst Institute, the bridge between academia and industry. How do we address this problem of big data versus small data, synthetic data versus actual accurate data? How do we solve that puzzle? Or at least, what are some mechanisms? What are some ways of addressing that?
Okay, I'm probably going to take this in a direction different than you have in mind, but that's the burden of being the chair, like learning cats. So I think, and this is one of the things that we're trying to do in the Pankhurst. One of the biggest challenges in our field is that there's lots of fantastic things you can prove with AI, that AI and machine learning can do in the lab. But it's really hard, I think, in the health domain to drive actual innovation with those AI and machine learning tools. It's been different in some other domains. So we've mentioned retail, for instance, travel. So there's obviously a number of domains where that's happened fairly quickly, you could say, but the health domain is lagging behind. And I think that's because we do not have enough people who have a good enough understanding of what is required in, for instance, a clinical setting, and also have a good enough understanding of what is possible with AI to bring those two things together. So what tends to happen all the time is that we've got really smart brains working with AI and machine learning on data that happens to be available, and they just develop something because the data happened to be available, but not something that was needed. And it's really hard to bring those two areas together, I think. So what we're trying to do is, for instance, train people with a clinical background so that they have enough understanding about machine learning so they can see what the opportunities really are. I hope, I'm not sure if it addressed you.
No.
Maybe it doesn't.
I think, well, you've answered part of that question, I guess, which is absolutely fine. But maybe I can redirect the question to Caroline. The issue of data and biases, and I think in your position statement you mentioned trust, right? Trusting technology. How do we trust technology? I guess we trust technology if it's accurate, right? If it produces accurate results, and there's a lot of hype and fear currently because of GPT-4 and all the things that it can do, and how it can integrate with a number of different technologies within the organization, within devices, with sensors, etc. That makes us both, I guess, excited about the future, but also fearful of the kinds of things that the outcomes that it can produce, because healthcare is a high-risk sector, right? The wrong decision could lead to potentially devastating outcomes. So how do we develop trust?
So I think trust isn't one thing. I think one thing can kill trust, but I don't think it's one thing. And I think the problem, the problem we have with AI, particularly when we're talking about, when we're talking about sort of probabilistic, so sub-symbolic AI, so this is things like deep learning and neural networks and things like this, is that it's the same problem we've always had, actually, with medical decision making, which is that we're really bad at dealing with probabilities, right? So when we make a decision, it's generally yes or no. Okay, should we do this thing or not? Should I, is this the right treatment or not? Should the treatment go ahead or not? And these kinds of things. And so I think the challenge there is for us as humans is actually when we are using it as a tool to help us make decisions, which is how we should be using it. And there are many different variations on that, is to try to get ourselves into a position where we're able to evaluate the information as well as we can. And of course, all people are different. So I gave some examples of what some people think about some technologies, but of course, everyone has different views. And there are lots of patients, for example, who are really happy to just trust the AI, okay? Or in the same way they would just trust their clinician. Some people want to be involved in decision-making. I think this is probably true for most people, but some people, particularly with chronic conditions, find that quite stressful, and where they can be monitored and they can just receive information which will help them make decisions rather than having to think about their condition all the time, then they're happy with that, right? And they don't have any problems trusting the technology. They're happy to just go with what it recommends. And so I think that the really tricky part is just making sure that people are getting accurate information, and we've discussed the difficulties with that, and also evaluating it effectively. And so I think with the kinds of highly regulated technologies we're talking about today. So this is the case for healthcare within Europe and the US and so on. But I think in more general terms, so things like ChatGPT, I think the issues are quite different, because where you are in a highly regulated environment, then we have to pass some tests in order to have confidence that it's going to work. Whereas when you're using ChatGPT to write an essay for you, it's really difficult then to evaluate whether it is giving you accurate information or not, unless you go and double check it all, which most students don't. So I think that I would be hopeful with healthcare that we already have the checks and balances built in, which will help us to use the tools appropriately. But everywhere else, it's all bets are off there. So.
Okay, I want to come back to Stephen on this point of, Caroline, you mentioned, different patients. Some patients trust the technology blindly, others question. So, Stephen, do you think that all patients want to have data about their condition? Do you think that everyone's ready and willing and trusting to use apps like the ones that you're developing? Or are you finding that there's also patients that are happy with how things are currently, without worrying about technology, without worrying about their data?
Yeah, so to start off with, the app is, having looked at other apps, probably one of the most sticky that I've seen, even though it, in other words, once people are using it, they seem to carry on using it. So we get, in the order of 10 to 15% of our user base using the system every month. Well, as it's used for health, sometimes people don't visit the doctor or do anything in health in a month. So we think that's remarkable. So the answer is they seem to want to do it. You also look at the spread of age of people using the app, and even up to the age of 90. We are, in percentage terms, representing the whole population. So if you look at the types of people who use it, either from a diversity point of view, or to say, generally, do people continue to use it and want to use it? regardless of your area of deprivation, regardless of your gender, your age, your ethnicity, we represent the population almost exactly. You'll remember that from when the COVID work we did, and that's continued. But I think the population is ready, regardless of age, but not all people, because we're all different. There are some people who just don't use social media. Some people who don't want to use a smartphone. I think I only know one. But there's not. There are some. We have to accept that. But what's great about this technology is it gives us the time to help them, because by freeing up the resource with digital technology, we can help them. So I think people are ready to embrace it. I think this concept of trust does come between them doing that, and so that I would disagree with one point about trusting healthcare. I'm sorry. I chaired drug and therapeutic committees in this area, and have watched the drugs that, based on the papers we read at the time, we approved, slowly get withdrawn. And then looked back at the papers that mean they were. And all I can say is that the bias in our health research is phenomenal, and driven, by a lot of things that mean that there is. I think there's very little confidence from a lot of people in that data. So therefore, my answer about trust will be slightly different. I think transparency, whilst we're using base facts, is very important. So our users need to know there's transparency, and they need to know that we haven't got motivations like GSK have. GSK are very clearly caught out again recently in making sure in their data being biased. So show that we don't have those motivations. We're a declared B Corp. We get assessed every year, that our purpose is ahead of our profit. Those types of things. But actually, if we could move to pure AI, we could have the concept of trustless. So in other words, why do we need to trust it if we know that the algorithm was written right in the first place to be impartial? So, and I think an example of that would be biopsy versus photograph. We don't intervene in any way. We simply let the algorithm learn. Well, how can you not trust that that's going to diagnose my mole for cancer? Yes, to a percentage chance. We have to get that concept there. But as long as we know that that was done, it's trustless. You don't need to stop and think about whether you trust it. But today, while you do have base facts to build on things, whether that's NLP and needing to know that the concepts and language are interpreted by base data that's been written to do that, while we know it could be biased, transparency is the key.
Could I ask a question, Stephen? So I think I'm with you, and we've discussed this before. I think we're on the same page that a lot of guideline-based clinical decision making is essentially driven by pharma money, right? But I think that I'm with Caroline when it comes to clinical safety. I think that's something that we understand really, really well after making some terrible mistakes back in the 1950s and 60s. And I do think indeed we've got the frameworks to understand what that means and how to check it. And I think that they should work for AI as well. Would you not agree with that?
Yes, there are things we can learn from the mistakes that were made in the early days with drug discovery that we could apply to AI. 100% agree with that. What I'm saying is that the industry is adept at getting around those things.
Yeah.
And so I don't think anything replaces having an organization, if you need to trust it, transparency, complete transparency, and lack of motivation to do the wrong thing. Nothing replaces that whilst you're using base data. And yeah, if we could get, that's still also the same. So building so for example, I couldn't help looking at our game of life, because what it does in terms of things you could do to be well, it does include the drug you're taking. It naturally does those because those are in the data. Okay. And SSRIs, Prozac, sertraline, used for depression. They're in the news a bit at the moment. And I was involved in selecting the right ones for Greater Manchester as a specialist centre on the Drug and Therapeutics Committee many decades ago. And it's still reflected in our data because Manchester used more sertraline than other places, and we chose sertraline at the time. So I just thought, I'm just going to have a look. So if you then say, what's the average intervention that people that will work for people? Sertraline and Prozac come way off the bottom of the list in this trustless system on what should you do next to be well. Yeah, as in it, by trust, I'm saying it's pure AI. It's just the maths. It's not somebody's opinion. Okay, way higher than that is, have you got a good friend? Do you get half an hour's exercise and fresh air each day?
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, which at the moment, which drug companies would say, well, my drug's not quite as good as going and get half an hour fresh air?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, this is a big topic, I guess, you know, the safety of medical devices, including AI, versus the openness and transparency behind the process of developing those medical devices in the first place, whether those are drugs or whether these AI technologies, and obviously the commercial interests that are behind those. I think it's a huge topic that probably deserves a different panel. But in the interest of time, I think I have some more questions, but I'll stop because I know there's also people in online, right, that are quite keen to ask questions, and obviously anyone in the room. So, Abby, or anyone online?
Hi. So my name is Ross. I'm a dentist by background, but I've also undertaken specialist training in public health. So I feel quite fortunate to sort of have a foot in both camps and doing a lot of informatics along with that. I suppose this is a question for Stephen. One of the biggest societal powers that healthcare providers hold is that they are, within the paradigm of Bradshaw's taxonomy of need, they can define normative need. So they can define when you're sick and when you're well. And that's a really powerful place to be. Do you predict that your product at some point in the future will be able to deliver a diagnosis and therefore be treading on the toes of providers who are able to offer that diagnosis and define normative need? And if so, how will you manage the difficulties that will surround the power structures associated with that?
That is a fantastic question. Here goes. Well, the World Health Organization says that sickness is when something occurs in more than 50% of the population. In this country, we say that a need is defined when it will cost less than £30,000 a year per quality adjusted life year to treat. I mean, that's what you mean, isn't it? And so the game of life I just talked about, it's talking about actually from most people in the room who would not consider themselves to be sick, but what should you do? Now, if it's looking at that something that's abnormal behavior, meaning not going out and getting sunshine or something, you know, and saying, well, we're going to send you an article saying the benefits of sunshine because your subjective happiness score is low, which is what we do. You know, we're already. Are we diagnosing? Can somebody tell me in the room? This comes back to medical device stuff again, because a diagnosis is a very false concept. It's only saying, what's the point we decide to intervene in our current model? You know, the World Health Organization's interventions are very macro, so it's easy for them to say 50%. We have to be more precise because we're limited by the cash and we have to ration healthcare. But what about actually telling people everything that they could do to be as well as they can be? And actually, we would be in a position where you can almost, from the base data research that we have, you can show that we'll then be able to afford healthcare. So to me, the only route to universal healthcare is to drop the barrier to diagnosis. Diagnosis is when I'm saying that, it's determining something that you could do to be more well. The threshold should be 0.
So it's almost like asking the wrong question. Don't try to treat, try to prevent.
Yeah, and if we do that, we'll be able to afford healthcare.
Thanks. Nikki Cullen, I'm a applied health researcher here at the university. So picking up from what I thought was Ross's excellent question, so much of what we can do to make people more well and prevent them becoming ill in the first place needs to be done at a society and a community level rather than an individual patient level. So, so if you look at where the biggest burdens of ill health are, for example, in Greater Manchester, they are people living in obesogenic environments where they can't buy healthy food easily, where all the food outlets that surround them are, producing food that's expensive and terribly bad for them. We're not teaching people how to cook healthy meals, and anyway, there's no outlets that will provide the vegetables to enable them to do that. So how do we strike the right balance in this wonderful world of data that can really pinpoint what you as an individual might be able to do to decrease your risk of ill health, when actually your socioeconomic circumstances are never going to support that to happen? So, what might be the role of a company like yours in working with bigger structures, using the data that you have to make life chances better for more people?
It felt like the question was for me, was it? I don't know.
Yeah, sorry.
Again, I'm monopolising the reply here.
Wow.
Does anybody want to go first?
Please go ahead with that one.
Okay. I would say I'll pick the people who have the data and they decide. But the starting point is I agree with everything. I shook my head at the beginning was I think just using the way that we do public health now is not the answer, because you can personalize things. So not everybody who's fat is sick, for example. Just telling everybody to lose weight who is fat is not going to work. But there's all that you've just described. 100% agree is a challenge, and the types of things that we were successful in doing, we want to do more of. Is during COVID, we were able to take the government guidelines and ask people whether they were following them, and then show the spread of the of COVID at that time. And it's interesting that none of the AI was successful, but we ended up with, I'm almost ashamed to say it, with police forces ringing us saying, what can we do about towns that aren't following the, so what I'm saying is people decided to focus on towns where they clearly weren't following the guidelines, and their chances of exceeding capacity in their local hospital was very high. And so we can do things like that, and the data is available to anybody who wants to use it. It's our users have all said they will use it for NHS public health, for university research. So if anybody wants to use it for that purpose, we'd encourage them, but we can't do everything. So I'd love to help if it's you or somebody with the data. We've got it. We can tell you what people are doing. And I think the guys in the corner, the example you gave is one often that I use, which is that this point of social deprivation is more complicated because I was influenced by the £100,000 loss of weight in Newcastle, where they demonstrated that fresh vegetables weren't available in the areas of deprivation. So even if you had the money, you couldn't buy them. I think the point you're making. And some of these things, we have worked with one GP where we helped him identify by postcode particular, he thought it was a particular takeaway where people were getting more heart disease when they went there. And he highlighted that and went to visit them to see how hot the fat was and things like that. So there are times when we've helped GPs do things like that, but love to do it more.
We have one in the back.
Graham Walton, Manchester School of Pharmacy alumni. Just wanted to bring things over more towards the NHS. There will be people here who will be aware of the fact that maybe just over 10 years ago, the NHS missed the opportunity of creating a universal record system with connecting to health, which ultimately resulted in £10 billion worth of investment being completely wasted. I think a system did come out of it, Lorenzo, that some regional health authorities adopted. But as far as I'm aware, nobody's using the Lorenzo system. So essentially, the NHS has nothing to show for that process. Do you actually believe that the NHS is now in a position where it can take full advantage and efficient advantage of AI? Or, and this touches on what Niels was saying, we had 100 different applications for COVID. We didn't need 100 applications. We maybe needed 2 or 3, ideally the best ones. And is AI going to actually result in the chaos that we saw with connecting to health?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. So, yeah, I mean, most of this happened before I came to the UK, so I'm not entirely up to speed with all the details, but I've heard obviously about some of those disasters. I personally still think that the UK is in a really brilliant position compared to most other countries around the globe to utilize their health data, and that is because we've got a universal health system, the NHS, which is free at the point of consultation, and nearly everyone, so more than I think 98% of the population, have an NHS number. That's a situation that exists in very, very few countries. The primary care record, which is standardized, is pretty complete when it comes to long-term conditions. Plus, we have everyone's hospital admissions and date of death. So all of that together is a very, very rich data set, and essentially we have that for the entire population in the UK. It's a much better position than we have in the country that, for instance, where I come from, the Netherlands, or worse even, for instance, in the US, where everything relies on commercial healthcare maintenance organizations, and you would never have a good population footprint, for instance. So yeah, I would say, despite the disasters from the past, in the UK, we are uniquely placed to learn from the data that we have, be it via AI or other means. But the data are unique, I think, and few other countries that would have similar data.
Abby, there's a gentleman here in the front.
Hi, I'm Tom Luntz. I've spent 30 years wading through this quagmire, medical records, how it's managed. You're talking about your solution, I notice you've flagged up this and other solutions out there in the marketplace. Isn't the issue for you or anybody else in this area of activity one of political solutions that won't happen? Because we're going back, we talked about Lorenzo, 10 billion was it, if I remember correctly, by an Australian outfit who said this was great. I'm going back 30 years, and Microsoft suggested similar solution that was rejected by central government. We've got a situation where we've got a national health service, but in reality is a many health service. And until we can address that and have a truly national health service that interconnects and works together, your solution or any artificial intelligence solution won't work. We need to bind all these together and get central government support to back that and make it work. And it will, in theory, work. But because government is short term, we're never going to get it. So whatever you may think, don't you think, and this is the question, that whatever you do as individuals and organisations, it will never actually come to fruition?
Yeah, another brilliant question. I'm guessing by the direct line of sight. I do use Evergreen Life, and the demonstration is I not only remember the national programme, but I remember the gossip programme before that. So it's worth talking about gossip for those who haven't that was the Government Open Systems of Intercommunication Programme, which was the previous, another one prior to Connecting for Health, it's another waste of money. But at the time, the NHS didn't know that there was going to be a standard for internet protocols. It was before IP was the standard, and they developed their own standard for not just the NHS but for military as well. But and at the time when I first set up part of EMIS, so that's the secondary care now. It's called Ascribe. That was the first company that I found and set up, and it worked in the traditional model. And at that time, just like the national programme wasted a lot of money and it was never used. There were gossip cards to put in your computer that cost a load of money that then got thrown in the bin because the ones you could buy down the road that were just, in those days, there were gossip cards at £600, which was a lot then, or you could buy a £10 NE 2000 card and stick it in the back of the car and it worked properly. So what I'm trying to say is that what was thought as being needed to be centralized control in terms of networking, where every organization in those days had their own intranet, has now become the internet. The internet wasn't imposed on us. It wasn't designed. It actually came by necessity, by collaboration. And what we believe is the way that we're doing Evergreen is that we're creating a paradigm where collaboration can occur, innovation can occur, which is outside but connected to what is inevitably going to be a politically driven organization. So I've seen it too many times in the way that you've just said, but I remain here optimistic that actually through people-powered health, that's why we call it people-powered, not government-powered, people-powered health, that we can all collaborate and create something like the internet was created. That means we have all the data we need for health to do the things we just talked about. So that's the optimism I'm trying to bring, and I think it's possible. Yeah, the danger we've got is that it's worse than the project failing or the money spent on it. Is what happens with government policy is it makes out it's going to do it, which then we're in the business school, and this is a really important fact, because by doing that, it kills the economic market for companies to develop in that area, because every investor will say, you know, why would you develop an app, Stephen? There's the NHS app. You know, can somebody tell me what it does? You know, oh, it gives me my COVID passport. That's why there's a lot of people using it. And yeah, so the problem is it exists, and they say they will do everything on it, and that's the problem. Anybody in the industry like you will know they never will. History says there's no chance because they're never going to be people focused. They're going to think of the needs of the NHS as they write it.
Yeah.
Do you feel more optimistic?
Yeah.
Oh dear. Oh dear.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
we have a lady in the back.
Hi, my name is Judith Reese, and I've spent 20 years in this field, 25 years in this field, working with technology, strategy, and those horrible pharma companies as well. My question is to each of you is, what needs to be true to be successful in this field? The question to each of you. What needs to be true?
What needs to be true?
Now, private health innovation.
Okay, I'll start. Okay, right. So I'll buy myself some time. I think that this relates to the previous question as well, right? So I think I don't think there is one thing. Okay, that's it, isn't it? There isn't one thing that needs to be true. There are many things that need to line up. And I had a really interesting discussion recently with an academic who works in healthcare technology. And he's more on the engineering side. And he was talking about the fact that he will have these discussions with clinicians and with industry, and what they want are two completely different things. And industry will be prepared to invest in technologies that clinicians are saying they don't want, because the industry doesn't believe and then I don't know who's right in that, by the way. I don't know who's right. You know, it could be anyone. But I think it's getting everything to line up is really hard. And I think typically with innovation, certainly the kind of, when you think about academic work, but I think it can be true in industry as well, often things happen 10, 20 years before everything lines up and you can actually get them into practice, because you need to have the will of, you know, the technology needs to work within the organization, it needs to work politically. So that isn't one thing, that's multiple things, but Neil's may have one thing. So
And thank you for buying me sometimes. Yeah, so my one thing is that you need to have an environment, an ecosystem where people coming from all those different directions, so industry, academia, healthcare, regulation, government, can effectively work together, where there's a culture of working together, not in one project, but over many, many years. And I think that's the environment where you can actually change things effectively. If you don't have that, extremely hard.
Can I also add, I think going back to what Stephen was saying, it's all about competition policy. I mean, I think in the NHS, in comparison to other markets, right, a startup struggles to scale, which is the most important thing about innovation. You may have the most amazing product, but you can never make it to scale. And most of it is related to government policies that do not allow technology companies to scale within a market, as opposed to an NHS trust by NHS, trust by NHS, trust by commissioning body by commissioning body. It's almost like starting again and again and again. I had this conversation recently with a company that was in Canada. They wanted to come to the NHS to scale, and it took them 10 years to develop the product and diffuse it within a single trust in Canada. And I said to them, why do you want to do the same thing again? You're killing yourself. So in my view, I think we need to change competition policy within the public sector. I'm not talking about privatizing the NHS. We need to change competition policy within the public sector if we want things to change.
In 2002, I got to know Stephen Dorrell, who's now on our board, who was Secretary of State at that time, and it was actually a Blair initiative to bring in Connecting for Health, and he basically said to me, well, there's nothing I can do about this. And this was in 2002, remember, just as the program went from 2002 to 2012. Everybody, including him, knew it wasn't going to work then. 10-year project that we spent. It was budgeted 10 billion, but it actually wasted far more than that. It's more like 30 billion. And he said the same question. So what's the one thing that you would do? In other words, I can't change this. This is now decided, but what can we do? And at that time, I said, let people own their own records, because the NHS can't look after them for them. And so that was my one thing then. And I believe it's unlocking, from what we've demonstrated already. And the way that we're working commercially, by the way, is that we are running practices and secondary care clinics on the same budget that the NHS gets for them, using digital technology driven in the ways I've just described, to then be able to pay the technologists and researchers to develop the next release of our software. We've had to learn to become a permanent model. And why have we had to do that? Unlike America, where you would get growth money to be £1 billion business before you know what you're doing. It's because a number of people went into this market saying they could do things and didn't realize the political headwind that they faced, whether that was Babylon, Renalytics, Sensign, etc., who are very, very highly valued 2 years ago, who are now either not existing or were less than 5% of their original value. And that makes it very difficult for companies like us to then get the investment, because the headwind has been demonstrated in the market. But we're lucky to have got as far as we've got and been able to scale. We're now 600 staff. We're looking after 3 million users, 20,000 patients every month go through our clinics. And they are delivering such efficiency that we've dropped the price of what the NHS pays and still are making more profit that then gets re-spent on research and development.
There's a lady in the back, and then
Hi, so you talked a little bit about bias in research and how historically there's quite a lot of it, rendering a lot of information essentially not very effective with its use cases. And then proceeded to go and mention how we can build AI that doesn't include this bias, but the AI doesn't write itself. Some person writes the AI. So how can we eliminate this bias in the system, which doesn't have a person to go back and check it, so that the reliable information that it puts out really helps people without the bias that exists?
So I would say it's very difficult to guarantee we would ever be able to do that. So I think the better the data we have, I think that's important. I think we still, though, need to be really mindful of the fact that every time we set up a system, we are going to be making assumptions. And this is true not just of AI. So I mean, AI is really just an extension of statistical methods, right? And we can misuse those as well, and we can misdesign our experiments and everything else. And so I think we saw some interesting things sort of around COVID, for example, when we were looking. So one example of this is conflating race with genetics, right? Which happened in some of the COVID analysis. And actually, when you look at the science properly, you see that things like environmental factors come into things. Obviously, race is a construction, so there are people may be of different ethnicities and have different genetics, but this is not the same thing. And so you end up you can make these really bad decisions depending on how you label your data, for example, right? So if you label it along racial lines, right, then that's going to become a feature which the algorithm is going to treat as being a completely reliable part of the data set. So I think you cannot really avoid it, but I think we can constantly take steps towards trying to minimize it. And I think making sure that we're constantly reflecting, that we have a diversity of people who are involved in development. I think those things are really important, because I talked to, again, people are find it very difficult to understand things outside their lived experience. So I think that we can take steps to improve that, but I think it's a collective effort, and I think that's where we sort of need to focus.
There's one online, and then there's one in the front, Abby. Yeah.
Got a question here coming from online from a doctor from Chester, who asks, does the panel think the issue of bias in our AI should go beyond transparency, given the implications of error or mistakes are magnified once applied? Caroline, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm happy to say something about that. Yeah, obviously this is a major issue, particularly because, so I know, Stephen, you talked about sort of truthless AI, but I mean, I would suggest, I think we can make sure our data is as accurate as possible, but I think there's always potentially that risk there. And people believe, so I've witnessed myself, doctors, in fact, believing the software, believing the AI, because rather than the ground truth data that they have, because it's like, well, the computer says it. So, the computers know what they're doing. They are kind of looking at this really objectively. And of course, that's not necessarily true, because it's people who are designing the algorithms and so on. And so I think we do need to be really aware of this, particularly if we're sort of relying on those results. And I think, again, it's just about awareness. It's about, increasing our understanding of the fact that this might be an issue and trying to minimize it. Yeah, so constantly working at it.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that Caroline just said about that. I do think it's important to realize that when we speak about bias embedded in AI algorithms, that's typically because the bias already existed, right? Yeah. So there was a bias, some systemic bias in our society or in our decision-making, perhaps in clinical settings, and that was reflected in the data. And then it also became reflected in the AI algorithm. Now, obviously, we don't want that to happen, because then you're creating this vicious circle, basically, where those biases get replicated and potentially even perpetuated. But it started with something that was wrong in the real world. I think the positive thing is that because of all this development, there's a bigger awareness now of such biases than there used to be. And there's a bigger opportunity also to study them. So not all of that, not all of it is so is pessimistic, I would say. It is very hard though to test whether there is a bias or not in your data and in your algorithm. So I think that's going to be a very long journey, and sometimes we will just not know.
And I think just actually, Stephen, the other thing that you said earlier, which I think is really important, is that it can also correct for bias as well. And I think that's actually a really important point here, because we might have biased data and then the algorithm becomes biased because of that, but actually people are extremely biased as well. And whilst we hear about the horror stories of the terrible things AI can do, at the same time, we can also see it really helping in terms of in some situations where people might be biased in their decision making, and that's, I think, really powerful as well.
Last question.
I think it's been a wonderful afternoon.
Can you yeah.
So I'm Peter Stokeman. I'm a venture capitalist at Evergreen, and we sell on hospital boards and hospitals. So I've been around. And I thought that starting with Stephen, wonderful stuff. The question that I'm puzzled about, and that seems to be circulating, what is this improvement in the economics of data going to do to the way in which we get health? And that's the picture. And I've got out of Stephen that it's going to be an individual. This is, I could see that, and I look at you, and you're saying this is you're trying to solve the NHS problem, and I just wonder whether you have any thoughts about how these sort of services are how we're going to innovate, and those services are going to be provided. At the moment, so if I just sort of come out with my final thing, I sat on a hospital board locally, and as a business, there was a cabal say, could we make an exceptional hospital, a really exceptional hospital, which is what I tried, which is in the sense what you get with the Americans. And I concluded within the way the NHS runs, you couldn't. It's too collective. And I just wondered, I'm just trying to what is the big picture coming out? Will we have organizations of quite different shape as a result of lower cost data and so on? What do I take home? Maybe that's too big a question.
I can probably speak to that. So my take on that is that data are an opportunity to learn. So if data are more widely available, that comes lower cost, there's more opportunities to learn. So that gives us the ability potentially to create what I call learning systems. In this particular instance, learning health systems. So systems that are all around, built around learning from the data that are generated by the system itself anyway, on a routine basis. All those health records are generated anyway. We can systematically try to derive insights from that about what is good and what isn't good, and implement those insights as improvements, innovations in the same system, and then evaluate also whether that actually has helped, right? Because that's the other thing that we need to do. Once we change something, we need to know, is this going to make a difference or not? So that closed the circle basically to further improvement. So there's always this cycle of ongoing improvements in any learning health system. It can exist at any level of scale. So it can be a hospital. It could be city region like GM, could be an entire country, could also be an individual, right? We can have a learning health system for an individual looking at their own data. So it's not something that is only there for the NHS or an NHS trust, but the concept applied at any possible level, I would say. But that's the opportunity.
That's a very helpful answer. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. So with that, we'll draw our evening to a close. I would like to thank very much Stephen and Niels and Caroline and Panos, our chair, for such a thought-provoking, challenging and insightful discussion of this frontier where technology is intersecting with big data and what it might mean for the future of the health service, for the future of the region, and for us as individuals. So could you please join me in thanking the panelists for such a stimulating evening. So we do have quite a full programme of events here at the business school, and before you leave, can I just draw your attention to one of our events next week on the 24th of May, where we will hear from Professor Raquel Ortega Arguelles, who is Chair of Regional Economic Development and Director of the Productivity Laboratory at the Productivity Institute based here in Alliance Manchester Business School. The title of that talk will be Data-Driven Academic Research for Supporting Smart Specialisation, Industrial Policy and Levelling Up. I do hope you will be able to join us for another stimulating evening. But in the meantime, please do have a safe onward journey and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.